And the road to truth is something that you must follow all the way down. There is not such a thing as a limited truth. You've got to go all the way when you start talking about the truth of life. You mustn't hold up and not find out what it is.
Whether braving hostile climates, a world war, or this jungle we call civilization, Ron walked a road to truth. He walked where few men had ever ventured, and those who dared never survived. He crossed through walls of fire and into the teeth of vicious government schemes. Yet despite these formidable barriers, he walked to the very end of that road. And even more remarkably, he built behind him a bridge so that others could safely follow. His journey began at a very young age, in a world where there were no answers. It was an era when the most that was known about the human mind lay in the works of Freud, and all Freud offered was a hope of being reasonably well adjusted to the environment. Although Ron knew that the answers he sought lay somewhere off the beaten track, his parents had insisted he pursue a traditional education in a confining Montana classroom. He was determined to discover the fundamental truths of life. I counted the months of captivity that stretched before and wondered whether or not I'd require a keeper, wrote Ron in his journal, having just turned 17. Then one spring afternoon, an angry teacher hurled an eraser across the classroom and knocked a young girl senseless. Ron promptly picked the man up, stuffed him in a trash can, and walked out of school. Within a few days, he boarded a train to the Pacific coast. There, he talked his way onto a military transport, and with only a pocket full of change, he set out across the Pacific to Guam, where his father was stationed at a U.S. naval base. On reaching Guam, Ron first had to face the fury of his father, who was more than just a little angry that his teenage son had left school and traveled halfway around the world entirely on his own. Then Ron had to sign himself aboard a working schooner because Guam was really just a stepping stone. His real destination was Asia, a land that supposedly held all the great wisdom of the ages. Yet when he finally reached the China coast and made his way through war-torn Peking and to the sacred lamaseries, he found nothing resembling a workable technology. Nothing to help the millions who were suffering from ignorance, poverty, and superstition. After spending more than a year in Asia, Ron returned to the West, where he continued his search while completing his formal education. He had decided that a professional writing career would give him the means and freedom to continue looking for answers. But his parents were adamant that it was impossible, especially during the Great Depression, to earn a living as a writer. They insisted that he study engineering at George Washington University. Engineering, however, was not all that Ron studied at the university. He was also pursuing his own research into the mind, and his discovery soon put him on a collision course with the psychology department that wasn't interested in anything beyond rat mazes and ink blot tests.
I went over for the first time to the psychology department and found out for the first time in my life that there isn't anybody who knows all about it on Earth. That was a shock to me. You see, I'd never seen a mystic do anything but practice with confidence. And I had never seen an engineer express anything but confidence and knowledge of his subject when he was building railroad bridges. And I was used to a world where men were expert, where they were positive, where they could get results, make an effect, and knew their business. And I had just put a foot in a morass, which not only didn't know, but didn't care to know, really. And these experiments were simply looked at. Well, it's quite interesting. Why did you do that? In other words, here was a segment of human knowledge which was letting us all down. And at that moment, I got very interested.
Concluding that his professors knew less about the mind than the lowest primitive tribe he'd seen in Asia or the Pacific, Ron left college and set out on his first research expedition into the Caribbean. Specifically, he was now looking for the lowest common denominator of life, a long sought-after foundation which would align all other knowledge. Upon his return to the United States, and despite his parents' objections that the answers he sought had already been discovered by psychology and psychiatry, Ron applied to the Guggenheim Foundation for a research grant. The foundation took a full year to make a decision, and in the end, instead of supporting new research into the mind and life, the grant was awarded to a butterfly collector. And so, Ron decided to finance the research himself with adventure stories drawn on his own travels. Although these were hard times for writers, and few earned enough to even pay for the cost of mailing off manuscripts, Ron soon became one of the top authors of popular fiction. But financial success did not make the job easier. In order to both support his family and still pursue his research, he had to produce as many pages in 3 days as most successful writers produced in a week. Eventually, however, he made his first major breakthrough, which he detailed in the manuscript Excalibur. He had isolated the common denominator he had long been searching for: survive. Yet, even as he prepared the manuscript for publication, he came to realize that the work was incomplete, and there was much more research to pursue. There were, however, those who felt Excalibur should not be laid on the shelf. One evening, at the New York Explorers Club, Ron was introduced to 3 Soviet trade representatives. The Soviets had heard of the manuscript and felt that Ron's discoveries could be used to motivate Stalin's workers. So determined were they to obtain his services, they even invited him to Moscow, offering $100,000 and free use of Pavlov's laboratories. Although Ron flatly refused, the Russians were not so easily put off. When he returned to his hotel room that night, he discovered that his copy of the Excalibur manuscript was gone. The Nazi Holocaust and World War II became the next hurdle in Ron's road to discovery, pulling him away from his research and embroiling him in combat with enemy submarines. Yet even under these stressful circumstances, Ron still managed to forge on. It was aboard an assault support ship, the crew of which were going mad under a psychotic captain, that he actually delivered his very first auditing sessions.
The medical doctor of that ship and I had the same cabin. And the men in the crew would come up to get bandaged up or something like that at all hours of the day or night. When the medical officer was out, they would get me, you see. I'd process them one way or the other. And when he was there, well, he'd give them pills and sew them up. So they had a good time of it. And I had an awful lot of subject matter to study. The medical officer turned it all over to me. He was kind of bored with it all anyway. He was...
Despite the war, Ron continued helping others in the months that followed. But by 1944, the cumulative injuries he suffered in combat had taken their toll. Lame from a Nazi torpedo and partially blind from the flash of a ship's gun, he was transferred to Oak Knoll Naval Hospital at war's end. There, waiting endlessly for treatment, he faced a world where all familiar patterns were gone, and most of his best friends had died. To make matters worse, his wife and parents had concluded that they would have to spend the rest of their lives tending to a hopeless cripple. And although they offered him a small room in the back of the family house, they insisted he give up any idea of further travel and research.